Today we're going to have a presentation on the Glen Leven and what's going on over there. Appreciate everyone coming out on such a wonderful day. It's beautiful outside. We've got a great crowd. Today we'll have Ridley Wills, a local author and historian. He will be presenting first, and then Ophelia Payne, and then Katie Randall, who is the education and outreach coordinator for the Glen Leven Mansion. So, with no further ado, I will turn it over to Ridley.
The first time I've ever been introduced by a man with a Coca-Cola in his pocket. What do y'all think Dolly Madison had in common with Edward R. Murrah? They were both from Guilford Courthouse, North Carolina. And so was Francis McNary, my wife's fifth great-grandfather. And so was Robert Thompson, Ophelia Payne's fifth great-grandfather. Those two men were 3 years apart. Thompson's a little older. And Thompson's life came to a very abrupt end. He was on the receiving end of a gunshot fired by William Tryon, the governor of the province of North Carolina. A group of farmers in the Piedmont area of North Carolina were protesting against high taxes and the fact that they thought some of their tax money was being squandered and others had been spent building a magnificent palace for Tryon. And that was correct. Tryon spent $13,000 in 1760 and brought an architect from London to design the most handsome home in the country. And so he marched out from Newbern, where the capital was, to Alamance Creek, where these regulators, as they were called, were. These were farmers, poorly armed, but they outnumbered Tryon's forces. Incidentally, one of Tryon's officers was Francis Nash. And so here Francis Nash was on the British side fighting the regulators 4 or 5 years before he's killed, fighting for the other side. They were lined up. The militia was well armed and disciplined, and so Thompson and a Presbyterian minister whose name I think was Caldwell tried to mediate this thing to prevent bloodshed, and Caldwell decided he was in trouble, so he went back to the Alamance Creek, the regulator side, but Thompson went over there, and Tryon said he was going to arrest Thompson and put him in jail, and Thompson turned to leave. Tryon grabbed a musket from a militiaman and killed Thompson. 10 years later, Thompson, who left a widow and about 10 children, the oldest boy, who was 20 or 21, and two friends of his decided to come west. And I don't know whether they started with James Robinson, but they ended up with James Robinson here at the Cumberland Settlements in December of 1779. Tommy, unmarried, signed the Cumberland Compact that spring after Donaldson arrived, but at the end of June or the 1st of July, he left. And that was a very precarious time here, but it was precarious for all the western settlements. He went up to Kentucky and volunteered to fight under George Rogers Clark. Clark was organizing militia to attack the Shawnee villages north of the Ohio River. So, and Clark won, and Thompson survived that, goes back because we're in a war with Britain. He gets caught by the British and thrown in prison. And Ophelia, didn't we find out that his parole was the day of the Battle of Yorktown? I don't know whether he was there, but that was the day he was paroled. He marries who was presumably a first cousin, not a first cousin, but probably a cousin from Guilford Courthouse. Y'all know the Hunt brothers in Texas. One time I saw Bunker Hunt's sister, Margaret Hunt Hill, at Belmead Plantation, and we were putting down some asphalt where the porte cochere was. She said, "Ridley, my daddy founded asphalt in the early 20th century in Texas. What are you doing that for?" I said, "Come back in 2 weeks and you'll just see pea gravel." And she said, "You know what asphalt did for the South? it enabled first cousins not to marry each other. Well, that's sort of what happened with Thompson. So he comes back. Now, of course, he's eligible for a 640-acre land grant, and he picks his as it was on a north-south axis, and it would be on both sides of what would later be the Franklin Pike, and both sides of what would be later the Nashville and Florence Railroad. He builds a blockade on the northern end of his property on a hillside overlooking the easternmost branch of Browns Creek. And that was the hillside where the Pepsi-Cola bottling company is today. He's got two boys who are born in the 1790s in the blockhouse. One of them, 1793, is John. John would grow up to be an astute businessman, something his father was anything but. His father was actually in danger of losing his land grant because he had gone as surety on the bond of some people who made loans and then couldn't repay them. So he had to do it. He also got in a lawsuit with, amazingly, his younger brother over his land. And all of us know how imprecise so many of the surveyors were in their work in the early settlements of Nashville. And he got in another lawsuit with one of the guys he came out here with. The first piece of property I see that John buys, he's still a teenager, but he is able to settle his daddy's lawsuits and not only regain the 640 acres, but he, over a period of time, builds it till it's nearly 1,000 acres, and one time had about 60 slaves there. He is very successful. He marries 4 times. First, 1823, and his wife dies in childbirth. 2 little boys who die quickly. Second one, marriage. The wife dies when the child is 10 months old, and he doesn't live to maturity. Then the third, his third marriage in the 30s is to Martha Rollins, and they have a daughter who does survive until adulthood. Duncan Eve, if anybody knows him, he is descendant of the Thompsons from that marriage. Thompson was said, Ophelia and I haven't decided whether to believe it or not, that he was the ugliest man in Middle Tennessee. Well, he was also said to have married 4 of the most beautiful women in Middle Tennessee. His 4th marriage, he's nearly 60 years old, and he proposes to a woman, Mary Hamilton House, who's 28. And I just this morning read a letter she wrote her brother, and she said to him, "You're going to be amazed and astounded at what I'm about to do, and I want your approbation." I haven't even told my brother who lives here. He said, John Thompson just left. He'd been out here for 3.5 hours, and he's proposed to me, and she marries him. Well, she not only marries him, she brings him 2 boys in the 50s. After they married 2 years, 1853, John's born. 2 years later, Joe, his brother's born. He is so thrilled. Now, they're no longer living in that blockhouse because, as we all know, the Indian Wars ended about 1795-6. He had built on about a half mile to the west a pretty commodious log house that he was living in that faced east toward the old Jackson Military Highway. And he told his wife, and he was so grateful for these boys, that he'd built her whatever she wanted. And she wanted bathrooms, and so he said, you can have bathrooms. And so he built a wonderful house that he completed in 1856, brick, two stories, a typical southern plantation house. The night they move in, it burned. They were able to knock a wall down and get the bedroom suite out of the master bedroom. Peggy Smith Warner has that bedroom suite in her house. Of course, she had to saw about 12 inches off each leg to get it in her house, but it's still there. And that just speaks to the continuity of this family in Middle Tennessee. The war comes, he's very prosperous, and he is asked, after the Federals capture Nashville, to sign the oath that General Harding was asked to sign, and all the major plantation owners were asked to sign, and that is to not help the Confederacy. And he signs the thing. He doesn't believe in it, but he signs it. Well, in the fall of 1863, the Federals are not sure that he has been faithful to that oath, so they send a man out in the evening, shabbily dressed as a Confederate officer, to Glen Leven. Well, there's a Federal guard there at the time, and when the guy gets there, John Thompson is in one of the double parlors visiting with his wife's daughter from an earlier marriage and her niece. And Mary pulls him out of the room, well, pulls the girls out of the room and tells them what's happened. And she has hidden this guy in a wardrobe so the Federal soldier won't see him, and so her husband won't see him. And she's not sure what to do. And the girls, who are teenagers, volunteer to take him that night across the turnpike, which is now moved to where Franklin Pike is today, to the home of, I know his name, but I can't remember it, Goodwin or something like that. And they do that. And, you know, you're trusting your 15-year-old children to take this guy over there. They've never seen him before in their lives, and in the middle of the night. A Union patrol goes by, and they hide in the bushes and get back home. Some months later, sometime later, it may have been years, I'm not sure, I think it's months, this guy writes Mrs. Thompson and says, I was not or am not a Confederate soldier. I was going to do some spying on the Confederate works, and somebody recognized me, and I also wanted to find out if your husband was adhering to his oath. That's why I came to your house. And he sort of apologized for what he did. Another time, Mrs. Thompson is on the back porch where the family spent the summers. And a Union officer rides up on horseback and barks some orders at her, and she did probably the smart thing. She just refused to answer him and ignored him. He got upset and shot at her, and it apparently the bullet went, mini ball, whatever it was, went through her hairpiece and knocked a chink out of the brick on the back of the house. And so one of the rites of passage for the successive generations of Thompson children and grandchildren was to be held up by their grandfather so they could put their fingers in the hole that the Yankee made when he tried to kill their grandmother. And Ophelia did that, and Peggy Smith did that, and everybody's done that. Battle of Nashville comes. The Confederates' line, Stephen D. Lee, has rifle pits on the northern edge of the plantation along present-day Thompson Lane, which then was a dirt road. He put it there because it was just outside the range of the cannon at Fort Negley. He wasn't prepared for the fact that late that afternoon on the 15th, redoubts 1 through 5 were assaulted by overwhelming forces of Union troops, and each of them successfully failed. Each had a couple of cannon and maybe 100 Confederate soldiers in them. So they failed that afternoon. Lee and Stewart realized that they had been outflanked, so they have no option but to retreat. And that evening they retreat through Miss Thompson's yard. She's out there offering them water from a cistern. They trample her vegetable garden, which included daffodils, which had been brought from Holland years before, and which you can still see. They're blooming right now, and they've been blooming since December. They trample that, and Stephen D. Lee sets up his next defense line on the heights of Peach Orchard Hill, just south of the Glen Leven plantation on Travelers Rest property. The Union, as a feint, General Stedman throws his colored troops, I think it's the 12th and 13th Colored Infantry Regiments, against Stephen D. Lee. And they're not sure whether these black men will fight. They did. They handled themselves valiantly, but they paid for it dearly. They did prevent Lee from reinforcing the left side of the shortened Confederate line at Compton's Hill. It wasn't Shies Hill yet. So they achieved that purpose. But 1,000 of the Union casualties were these black troops who could not successfully do what they were asked to do, and the Union probably knew they couldn't. 91 of them were buried at Belmead. Katie has researched some of them, and we think several of them grew up at Glen Leven. Elizabeth Queena has done some research on this, and she found 61 who were from Maury County, and I think she's had some success in getting an historic marker put down there near the courthouse to honor those black soldiers. Well, Thompson dies in the 70s. His boys are growing up. One marries Con McConnell. He actually wanted to marry Judge John Overton's oldest daughter, and they were engaged, but she broke the engagement and went to England, so he just stuck around and picked up the next one coming along. And she moved to Glen Leven, and if you go to Glen Leven, and many of you have, you'll see that a lot of the house has changed because his oldest daughter had diphtheria at age 6 and died in his arms, and he didn't know what in the world caused it, and had the house defumigated and pulled the wallpaper off and sent his family to live at Travelers Rest for a year before they came back, and tore down the spiral staircase and tore out a lot of the some of the fireplace mantels and replaced it with oak. John, too, marrying John Overton's daughter, you know the next thing's going to happen, of course. John Overton has got the Maxwell House Hotel, then one of the great hotels in the South. And John agrees to furnish him vegetables from Glen Leven's farm, which he does. And so now, 120 years later, the chef at the grill at the Hermitage asked Greg Vital do you think the Land Trust would let me put a garden at Glen Leven? And so Jeannie Nelson, our CEO, asked me, because I'm a historian, Ridley, do you think we can do this? And I said, listen, we did it in the 1880s for John Thompson, and if we did it then for what was then one of the greatest hotels in the South, we can certainly do it now for one of the greatest hotels in the South. So that happened. The second John would live till 1819. And I want to say one other thing about him before I turn it over to Ophelia, and that is for 50 years, James E. Thompson, whose wife wrote that wonderful book on handsome homes in and around Nashville, Tennessee in 1911, he lived at Longview across the turnpike from Glen Leven. And once he said, I can stand on my front porch and hear John Thompson, second John Thompson, yelling at his boys, John, Joe, and Overton, all the way across the highway. So he had a loud voice, and I'll turn this over to Ophelia.
Well, nobody tells these stories like Ridley does. Thank you. I have a good friend who took a tour with Ridley a couple of weeks ago, and she said, I felt like he knew those people by the time I left. So sometimes I feel that way too. I'm going to show you all a couple of pictures very quickly just to get started. What I'm going to show you is some pictures of, one is a portrait of John Thompson. There's so many, in our family, in the Thompson family, there are many Johns and Johns and Cons and Overtons, and we tend to refer to them as First John, Second John, Third John. So as I talk, if you can keep them straight, you're doing better than most of the members of our family. This is a portrait that we have a copy of because of the Colonial Dames Portrait Project, but this is a portrait done by Washington Cooper of First John, and this is the man who was supposed to be the ugliest man in Tennessee. I like showing this image because this is a pretty good picture of him. Let's see. This is Mary Hamilton. This is a photograph of a Dodge portrait that is owned by her great-great-grandson, and it was done in 1851. She is the fourth wife. She was the fourth wife who married him when he was 58 and she was 28 years old. She had married for the first time at the age of 14 and then was widowed. She had married a doctor and within a year married John Thompson. Where is that picture? In California. This is a late 1890s portrait. We call this the namesake portrait. This is John Thompson on the far left, second John. Joe, his brother, is on the far right. These are the two sons of First John. John, these are of the men, John and then Joe. In the middle is Colonel John Overton. And then standing behind John is his son John. In Colonel John Overton's lap is Overton Thompson, who is the younger brother. The three children, the three boys are all brothers. Overton Thompson, who was my grandfather. And then Joe is actually the nephew of the man seated to the right. He did have around 1900, I can't remember if it was 1900, 1901, his own son whom he named Joseph Hamilton Thompson. So it's a complicated story. And then finally, this is a wonderful portrait of, on the left is, if any of you knew Mimi Orr, Mary Hamilton Thompson Orr, and then on the older woman is Mary Hamilton Thompson, the one you saw the Dodge portrait of. And we believe this was taken maybe just a couple of years before her death. So I want to give credit briefly to some of the resources that this information comes from. Mary Hamilton Thompson Orr, who was born in 1879, was the family historian. She collected many documents and fortunately for us left those in the Tennessee State Library and Archives where we can access them today. Her daughter, first daughter, Mary Hamilton, but who we call Polly, wrote a delightful history of Glen Leven, which has given us lots of information about the house and about the life lived there. I also owe a great debt to Joe Thompson, who many of you knew, who interviewed the younger woman when she was in the 1950s about her memories, as well as her niece about her memories, and gave a paper in 1975 right here that I came to on the Thompson family. So, and then finally in 2010, the Center for Historic Preservation at MTSU did a remarkable, comprehensive historic structure report on Glen Leven, and which I think you can access on the web. And they also they pulled a lot of this research together and did even more research on the house and the family. Anything I tell you today has come from all of those sources. Ridley has covered the 19th century. I'm going to pick up on the 20th briefly. In 1901, Mary Hamilton Thompson, the fourth wife of John Thompson, and who survived him by 25 years, died at Glen Leven in June, just a few weeks short of her 77th birthday. She had lived at Glen Leven for almost 50 years. The house had been built for her. She had raised two sons, survived horrific experiences during the Civil War, and helped her older son, John, second John, and his wife, Mary McConnell Overton, to raise 6 children to adulthood. They had 7 children and lost that one daughter who died at the age of 5 from diphtheria. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the 6 surviving children had reached adulthood and they were all getting married. They all got married between 1902 and 1918. 2 of the 3 daughters were married at Glen Leven. Life was good, the farm was prosperous, and John Thompson, lawyer and farmer by profession, was involved in community and state government. He served on the boards of the University of Nashville and Montgomery Bell Academy, as well as the president of the Nashville Sulphur Springs Company. He'd entered politics in the 1890s and was elected Speaker of the State Senate in 1895 and was appointed Commissioner of Agriculture for the state of Tennessee from 1907 to 1911. He was a strong advocate for progressive agricultural techniques and also education, agricultural education in the schools. he thought agriculture should be taught in elementary schools, and I just know he would love the fact that schools are bringing back gardens now and that community gardens have become so popular. Home at Glen Leven, Con Overton Thompson was overseeing weddings, the arrival of grandchildren, and the garden that she and her mother-in-law had planted together. Ridley mentioned, and this is one of the really significant findings we've had, Ridley mentioned that in 1837, First John had ordered bulbs, this little Narcissus jonquilla simplex from Holland. He ordered them because the two daughters by his first marriage had tuberculosis, and both of them would die before they were 20 years old. And he was told by their doctor that it would be good for them to spend some time outdoors. That flower was kept going by Mary Hamilton Thompson, who had her own garden, and then Mary Hamilton, after the Civil War, Mary Hamilton and her daughter-in-law, Mary McConnell Overton, planted a new garden, kept this flower going, and when my mother came to visit Glen Leven, visit Nashville, and meet the Thompson family, she remembers every house she went into, she saw and smelled this flower, which is very, very pungent. 2 springs ago at Glen Leven, one of my big memories is of that flower growing at Glen Leven and my grandfather having it. We found about half a dozen still coming up at Glen Leven. These are from the bulbs from 1837. And so now we have a little daffodil hospital going in the garden at Glen Leven, trying to keep this flower going. It has a very, very small petal, but very, very strong scent. A recent visitor to Glen Leven described the soil there as a hot spot in Davidson County. Not all the soil. Those of you who've maybe lived here all your lives and maybe tried to garden know that not every piece of land in Davidson County is good for gardening, but Glen Leven really is. And Tyler Brown, the chef at the Capitol Grill, when he first started farming out there and put his garden out there, was amazed at how rich the soil was and how instantly everything grew. In 1911, well, I'll show you one quick picture. We have, sorry. This is a picture taken in the early 20th century. We have just a few of these of the garden at Glen Leven. We think that's Mary McConnell Overton in the background. In 1911, as Ridley mentioned, Glen Leven was included in Mrs. James E. Caldwell's book, Historical and Beautiful Homes Near Nashville, Tennessee, and I brought our copy of that, which I put on the table over here if anyone has not seen it. And Con Thompson contributed cut flowers and plants to a 1910 flower exposition at the Parthenon, organized by the Nashville Art Association. I've been trying to get more information on that.
What are these flowers?
I don't know. I'm not a gardener, but I'm not sure what those are. Iris. Those of you who are more gardeners than I.
Right, it looks like they could be iris.
But they are plentiful. I read her obituary not too long ago, and about a third of it is devoted to the fact of how much she loved gardening and how much she helped the younger people in the family and friends and neighbors start their own gardens. Also, and I learned recently that there was a dairy at Glen Leven in the early 20th century. Joe Thompson, the little boy you saw, who was one of the 3 sons of John Thompson, of Second John, was the one who thought he might go into farming, and he had a dairy at Glen Leven, and he was known for his buttermilk. And we have found some little tokens for his buttermilk at Glen Leven. With the advent of World War I, a son and 2 son-in-laws enlisted, and their wives and children came to live at Glen Leven. Glen Leven has always been full. The bedrooms are big, and we have all sorts of letters and documents, letters mainly, that mention children being cared for at Glen Leven, family members coming to stay at Glen Leven while their house was being worked on. It was always a place full of family. During World War I, there were 4 families living there, and each one had a bedroom. There was 1 bathroom at the end of the upstairs porch, and when it was cold, you had to stand in line at the door to the porch and wait your turn to race across the cold porch to the bathroom. My father remembered wanting to be one of the first up so you wouldn't be the last in line. Each mother was responsible for keeping her own fire burning. There was no central heat in Glen Leven. And the upstairs hallway was where the children met to play when they could not play outdoors. Polly Orr Jordan, who wrote the history of Glen Leven I mentioned, remembered those days in this way. These were the halcyon days for the grandchildren. The grown-ups were far too caught up in the hysteria that accompanied the war to give much time to supervision. Frequently there was no school, and always there was an adventure. The gang of children numbered 10, and a half-dozen horses and a pony cart at their disposal. If a youngster did not answer when called, it was assumed he was merely out of earshot and would probably turn up at the next meal. I'm going to show you a picture of this is my father not looking very happy, and Con Harris West on one of those ponies. And here is a photo taken sometime, the date under it was 1917, so it must have been early on. These are all the grandchildren who are living at Glen Leven. Infinite were the games to be played, says Polly. The favorite climbing tree where the early Tarzan books were reenacted was a smooth-barked English field maple. The cavernous basements under the back of the house served equally well as the prison of the Count of Monte Cristo or the trenches before Verdun. If you were nice to Uncle Abe, you could sneak into the cow barn at milking time and try your hand, or better still, get him to squirt the warm stream straight into your mouth. When the hay was being cut, you might be lucky enough to find a nest of baby rabbits. There were cool watermelons in the spring house in season, or hot ones in the patch, which did not taste quite as good, but you could eat more of them. Quieter interludes were spent listening to First Con, that's Mary McConnell Overton, First Con, read a Waverley novel, or shivering in terror as one of the older ones read a Poe ghost story. One day, a balloon came down across the road from Second Mary's house, and once, glorious of days, Charlie Chaplin himself spent the afternoon. Well, I'm still researching that, but I have found that Charlie Chaplin did appear at Ryman Auditorium on April 18, 1918, to sell Liberty bonds. He raised $375,000, and he had all the checks made out to him so that when you got your canceled check, you had his signature on the back. Well, I've yet to find any check written by the Thompsons, but I would love to know if he really did visit. In an interview with Con Harris West, another of the children who lived at Glen Leven during that time, she noted, "All historians acknowledge that something happened shortly after the year 1900 that changed the tone of Western history from what was a relatively orderly 19th century to the wild and changing and restive period we've lived in, or referred to as the 20th century. You can choose whatever moment you want to name: the death of Queen Victoria, the death of Edward VII, the sinking of the Titanic. Whatever it was a change. And for this reason, I've always had a funny feeling that in spite of the closeness of us 11 John Thompson grandchildren, because there was one born after World War I, you youngest three, Harriet, Alice, and Joe, were somehow different from us pre-war children because you never experienced that old-fashioned atmosphere that prevailed before 1917. Things were really going to change after that. In 1919, all the men returned home. Second John had held the place together, and he died in September of that year. Even though his widow was still alive, the division of the land began with John Thompson's death. It was a fairly complicated transaction. There were about over 400 acres, and there were 6 children. One of the children died in a hunting accident in 1921, so there would be 5 children it was divided among. And even after the divisions, there were redivisions and there were swappings, and it's really hard to track down all the changes. But they were all still on that same land that went back to the 1780s and Thomas Thompson. The oldest daughter, Mary Orr, Mimi Orr, widowed in 1920, moved in with her mother for a few years before Con's death in 1924. And after Con's death, she moved out, and her sister, Con Thompson Harris, and her husband, Al Harris, moved into Glen Leven, and they worked together to time it so that Glen Leven would never be empty for a night. So Mimi moved out, and Con moved in, second Con. The Harrises oversaw the widening of Franklin Road in 1928. They put in city water, they added an upstairs bathroom, and they looked into the possibility of heating the house. But after they got the estimate, the contractor they worked with came to them and said, this house, these walls are so thick and the foundation is so strong, he said, it would be cheaper for you to build another house to live in the wintertime than to try to put central heat and air, or central heat into this house. And so they didn't. And they lived there without central heat and air. In the 1930s, the Federal Writers Project visited the Harrises at Glen Leven, and in the book, Tennessee, A Guide to the State, they wrote this description. The wide lawn is shaded by many fine trees. It still is, including a giant paulownia, several English field maples, which grew from Kew Garden cuttings, and a number of yellowwood trees. The garden contains many varieties of narcissi, daffodils, and hyacinths, some of the bulbs imported from Holland in 1837. Con Harris had inherited her mother's love of gardening, and she was one of the founding members of the Garden Club of Nashville. And many of you have undoubtedly seen the page on Glen Leven in the 1936 History of Homes and Gardens in Tennessee. Con Harris's husband died at Glen Leven on Pearl Harbor Day, but at Glen Leven in 1941. And her daughter, Con Harris West, moved in during World War II when her husband left to fight. Susan West, who would be the last owner, lived there for 4 to 5 years with her mother and grandmother, and one of her closest friends was Ridley Wills' wife, Irene Jackson. And she has wonderful memories of Glen Leven, including playing dress-up with on the clothes in the attic, with putting on all the old clothes in the attic, sitting on the porch, or going down into the greenhouse and looking where Con was nursing all these cuttings and flowers. Let me show you quickly. It's just a wonderful old, isn't that a wonderful chasing a chicken? This is a photo that I feel sure Joe Thompson took because he was taking photos from the time he was 15 years old, sitting on the porch at Glen Leven. And that is second Con Harris, and then Alice Thompson, Joe's younger sister, Con Harris West, Susan West, who would be the last owner of Glen Leven. There she is, about a 5-year-old little girl. Joe Thompson Sr. and his wife, I'm drawing a blank, Florence Fondy Thompson. And I don't know what the dog's name was. In 1946, Con Harris moved to Athens, Georgia. Glen Leven was lived in by different owners in about 20-year stretches. So there was 20 years the first part of the century, 20 years with Con Harris, 20 years, and then the 20 years from 1946 to 1968, my grandfather lived there. And I thought everybody's grandparents lived in a house like that. My grandfather also loved farming. There was one story I forgot to read to you. In 1941, the 3 surviving daughters of second John Thompson were all widows and all living on part of the original Glen Leven farm, but they didn't live together. Polly wrote, "The hilltop was occupied by the 3 sisters, each living alone. The lifestyles of these strong individuals were so different that not for a moment did any of the 2 consider living together. Each had the deepest affection and admiration for the others, but they could work an argument to a fever pitch on whether or not to stake tomatoes or the day to plant turnip greens." So in 1946, Con Harris moves to Athens, Georgia to live with her daughter, whose husband was a professor in the English department at the University of Georgia. And the house was given to my father, Overton Thompson, Jr., who was then unmarried and had just returned from World War II. My grandparents were living in the house that they had built on Thompson land over on Glen Leven Drive in 1929. But he and my grandmother moved to Glen Leven, and I don't think I really appreciated till recently the sacrifice my grandmother made to move to that house with no heat. They lived there for 22 years, just as he had lived there in the 1880s and 1890s. No heat, They did have electricity. Not exactly as he lived there in 1890s. Well, they had electricity then, I think. They did have electricity, and we had space heaters, and there was always a fire in the fireplace. My grandfather loved farming. He raised cattle, he grew hay, flowers, all kinds of vegetables. He'd studied agriculture at Cornell University and experimented with planting magnolia trees from seed, and the old house was never in better shape. My siblings, cousins, and I have great memories of Sunday afternoon visits, driving out to the pasture to count the cows, creating plays in front of the pier mirrors, and how very cold it was to sleep in that house with no heat. But it was a totally child-friendly environment, and we all loved it. In 1957, my grandparents hosted a 100th anniversary of the building of the house, and I'll show you that picture, which I've also put over there. And all the surviving children of Second John, the grandchildren of the builder of the house, were there with multiple grandchildren of their own. Moving quickly over the last 50 years, after my grandfather's death in 1968, the difficult decision was made to sell the house. Without going into detail, it was offered to many members of the family. No one was in a position at that particular point in time to take it on. And in 1969, it was sold to Shelby Singleton, the music producer. He also had plans drawn up to heat and air condition and add bathrooms to the house, and after 2 years decided it was just prohibitively expensive. And so he decided it was never occupied during those 2 years, and he sold it in 1971, and Susan West, my second cousin, bought it in February of that year. Susan deserves enormous credit for the work she did to restore Glen Leven and repair damage done by vandals who moved into the house during that time. She kept the farm going. She hired caretakers to live in the house for the first 20 years or so. She struggled with the Tennessee Department of Transportation to protect what she could of the land when I-65 went through and when the Armory Drive exit was put in. When you drive down there, think about Glen Leven, driving over former Glen Leven land. She continued raising cattle and practicing the latest in agricultural techniques. She had studied agriculture at Duke. My husband asked me last night, I wonder if they still teach agriculture at Duke. I don't know. And with Joe Thompson's encouragement, like so many Thompsons before her, she loved the land, she loved animals, and she wanted to see this historic landscape so close to the city preserved. And so with the encouragement of Joe Thompson, she left the land in her will to the Land Trust for Tennessee. If families have themes, the themes of the Thompsons at Glen Leven might be a commitment to family, a commitment to and a love of farming, gardening, and a deep attachment to the land. I want to conclude with a brief section from a letter written by Polly Jordan Orr to her cousin John after coming to visit her mother at Glen Leven. Dear Johnny, you cannot imagine the peace of the month of long, hot summer days I spent in Nashville. Mimi is as happy there in the country as I've seen her. There's a calmness and a detachment that comes from digging in your own dirt and watching your own things grow. She has always felt the continuity of the land, and she likes to think of Bubs, her grandson, loving that same earth. We've planned enough devilment for his summers to occupy a Peter Pan. The Land Trust is shepherding forward the legacy of Glen Leven, and we are all so excited about the plans they have for the future. And so I'm now going to pass this over to Katie Randall, who will tell you what's going on at Glen Leven now.
Many of you have been to Glen Leven, actually. I know I recognize a lot of your faces. How many of you have been out to Glen Leven so far? Yeah, so many of you will know what I'm talking about because you have been there and seen it for yourself. I was hoping to bring a little bit of it here with me today, but I didn't know about needing an adapter. So anyways, as Ophelia said, my name's Katie, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Land Trust at Glen Leven. Glen Leven today is 65 acres of what was the original 647-acre land grant. It's right on Franklin Pike, as many of you know. Most people who come out to see us say they didn't even know we were there. They pass by it every day, and they had no idea. And I think part of that was because it was lived in as a private residence until 2006, when Susan left it to the Land Trust. One of the reasons I think Susan decided to go with the Land Trust when she left the estate to the Land Trust was because of the mission of the Land Trust, which is to preserve Tennessee's natural and historic landscapes for future generations. And I think that was something that was really important to Susan, and thanks to her generosity and foresight, this land can never be subdivided or developed. In fact, her will has a few stipulations in it. The land is actually divided into 3 sections, the largest being the bulk of the 65 acres, and that can't be subdivided, developed. No new roads can be put in, no new structures can be built on it, so it will remain green open space forever. And then there's a smaller tract of land right outside the house tract that had a few less restrictions on it. And then the house tract actually had the fewest restrictions, the house and 5 acres that it sits on. She wanted the Land Trust to have a little bit of leeway if they needed to sell the house and 5 acres to have the revenue from that sale to maintain the rest of the property. And after the first few years that the Land Trust owned the property, I think they spent a lot of time consulting with the community, consulting with experts in preservation and land conservation, and sort of decided what direction they wanted to take. And I think they thought about selling the house and 5 acres to benefit the land, but in the end they decided to keep the house and 5 acres to benefit the land. So that sort of brings us to where we've been the last couple of years. Our executive director, Liz McLaurin, who couldn't be here today, spent the better part of the last couple of years working on a conditional use permit with the city of Oak Hill. Because we are zoned residential, we're still allowed to do agricultural things because we were grandfathered in. The property has been farmed since 1780, so no one had a problem with that. But to do non-residential things that generate revenue to sustain the property, we needed to get an allowance from the city of Oak Hill to do that. We finally got that allowance last October. So we're very excited about that, and finally getting to sort of look towards the future and what we're going to do at Glen Leven. What we've done so far are all low-impact activities, which of course go with the mission of the Land Trust to conserve land and to protect the open space. We've done some field trips, some pilot programs with field trips. We've had Lead Academy Charter School and University School of Nashville out. Kindergartners have come out and have been able to touch and see cows, maybe for the first time. We had one little girl from Lead Academy who had never picked a flower before. She came to Glen Leven and got to pick a flower from our garden. The kindergartners were amazed that cows are furry. They were amazed that carrots grow in the ground. Last fall, I was out with a group of the kindergartners, and we all learned together what a sesame plant looks like with the sesame seeds in it. And we broke open a pod and we looked at the seeds, and we talked about how those are what are sprinkled on top of your hamburger buns. So it truly is an amazing place, and truly is a place that can be used over and over again for everyone from the youngest of kids to the oldest generations, to educate all of us about the importance of land conservation and where food comes from, and historic preservation of the house, and the history of Tennessee. So as we move forward with that, probably the largest use, at least in acreage, are the agricultural uses that continue on the property. We have a local farmer. He's actually from Dixon County, and he grazes a heritage breed cattle out there right now, but we're in the process of switching over and getting shorthorn cattle, which we're very excited about because that's actually what second John Thompson grazed in the 1880s. So we're really excited about returning to shorthorn cattle at Glen Leven. He also received a grant from NRCS to put in a rotational grazing system. It's a progressive grazing system, farming method that it allows for the cattle to be rotated from paddock to paddock. I think when they're done, there'll be about 10 paddocks, and the cattle will be rotated from one to another every 3 or 4 days, and that will allow the grasses to regenerate. All of the farmers that we've talked with so far who have implemented this type of program on their farms call themselves soil farmers or grass farmers, because they say if their soil and their grasses are good, then their livestock and their vegetables will do well also. So that's the approach that we're taking in that respect. Maybe one day we'll add other livestock, but right now we have about 15, I think right now, red pole and balancers that graze at Glen Leven. We also, as Ridley and I think Ophelia mentioned, have a 2-acre vegetable garden that's maintained by the Hermitage Hotel for use in the Capitol Grill in their kitchens. And I had this really great picture of Tyler Brown actually digging down in the dirt. Executive Chef Tyler Brown, he's there all the time tending the vegetables. And this has really given us a beautiful example of sustainable agriculture for us to show our visitors, to show school kids. It's been a really, really great experience so far. And then the other thing, which is relatively new, so I hope I don't mess it up telling you about it, but we actually had some beehives that were donated to us from LifeWorks Foundation. We harvested our first batch of honey this past fall, but now we've got a new group of volunteers that have been trained in biodynamic beekeeping. And don't ask me to tell you what all that means, because I do not know. But we're all learning together, and they're hoping to implement these practices of biodynamic beekeeping on our site, and then we'll be able to use it for educational purposes, to teach kids about the bees and to teach myself and others about the bees and how it all works. So we're very excited about that, and hopefully we'll have much more honey to come in the coming year. Let's see, what's the other? Lastly, I mean, really, I just want to talk about the ways that we're involving the community at Glen Leven, from the field trips. We're also now, since October, since we got the conditional use permit, we can do special events. We can do small, low-impact weddings, corporate meetings. We are booking group tours for garden clubs. We've had a few different chapters of the DAR come out already. So we're doing some smaller group tours of the house and grounds, and we also do special events. We've had, I guess, 2 years of harvest and history days, and we had a pumpkin patch the last 2 years for kindergartners to come pick a pumpkin out of the patch and see how a pumpkin actually grows. And we, this Christmas, had our first open house, holiday open house, where people had the opportunity to come walk through the house. So though we're not open to the public, there are plenty of opportunities to come see us. The best way to be informed about those opportunities would be through the Land Trust website, which is landtrusttn.org. Or if you have Facebook, you can like our Facebook page, and we'll post any of those events there as well. Or you can contact me directly, and I should have brought my cards today, but come speak to me afterwards if you're interested in bringing a small group for a group tour. We'd be happy to have you all. Lastly, looking forward in our foreseeable future, what we have planned is we're working with Lipscomb University Sustainability Institute. As Ophelia mentioned earlier, we're continuing to work with MTSU and their Center for Historic Preservation, and we're building a relationship currently with Overton High School. Their garden club is actually going to be out on our property in the spring to help us plant an educational garden right behind the house where the family's kitchen garden used to be. So we're very excited about that. So if you're interested in coming out to visit, talk to one of us and we'll get you connected. We're also looking for volunteers. So if you're interested in volunteering, we'd love to have you come out in whatever capacity you can give. We're actually going to have a volunteer coffee, a little get-together where we'll talk about the volunteer opportunities coming up, and there'll be an opportunity to sign up for some of those things, and then I think we'll take a quick tour of the property at the end, and that'll be on March 8th if you're interested. So just come talk to one of us. We'd love to talk to you more. And thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? We've got 1 minute left.
Katie, the program sounds wonderful. It's a great contribution. I'm curious, in the future, are there any plans to interpret the historical landscapes, like what you're going to be talking about at TSU?
Well, we actually just received a grant from the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area and a grant from the Civil War Trust to continue doing research and to interpret the Civil War at Glen Leven. So the grant from the Civil War Trust is much more recent, so I haven't exactly decided what we should do with that. But from the Heritage Area, we're planning to have an interpretive website with access to some of these resources that we've talked about today. But we also are going to do a 4-panel freestanding exhibit, which will cover probably the military history, the family history and home front, the African American history, and the medical history, since it was used as a Union Field Hospital. So we are looking to do that, and looking for other ways too. I mean, we've talked about, we want to limit, I think, the interpretive signage on the property because we're not a historic house museum per se, and because we want to leave it kind of open so that people can come and discover and ask questions. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
How many ghosts are there?
Honestly, my response to that question is always, it's the friendliest house I've ever been in. If there are spirits there, they're friendly. Yes, ma'am.
How do you heat the house?
Well, the back part of the house where our offices and meeting space are has a new central heating and air unit. Many of you might remember there was a fire in the back part of the house. Was it 2 years ago now?
It was February, yeah, 2 years.
2 years ago this month. Yeah, and after that, they did install central heat and air in the back part of the house, but then the front part of the house does have central heat and air that Susan put in the 90s on the downstairs. So it doesn't, and half of it's actually broken right now. So right now, half of the house downstairs is heated. So it's a little chilly. Any other questions?
But just wondering if there's plans to eventually have the house open for public?
I don't know if it will ever be open set hours throughout the week. I don't think that that's the Land Trust's goal, but they foresee doing educational programs out there on a daily basis. So it will be open in some capacity. It just may not be open to the general public every single day. It'll probably be, what we're looking at is doing field trips on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and then doing other educational things on Mondays and Fridays, and filling in when students are testing and things like that, we can fill in with other educational opportunities. But that's kind of what we're looking towards. And I meant to mention the stabilization campaign, which we, over, I guess, the past 18 months, Ridley here has chaired our stabilization campaign to raise $1 million just to stabilize the house. This isn't a restoration effort. It's purely to preserve it as it is and to prevent further deterioration. And I think, what are the numbers, Ridley?
We've raised $850,000 to preserve the house.
Mm-hmm.
Another $180,000 for other purposes.
And we've been since October. We launched a campaign to adopt a window at Glen Leven, where you could pay for the restoration of a window and the coordinating blinds. And I think Ridley's just about sold all the windows. How many have you sold?
We sold 31 windows.
31 windows. Yeah.
Got 13 left.
So he's 13 left. If anyone's interested, you can talk to this man. He's been busy. No, that's total. They're priced according to what all they need, and so they're anywhere from $1,500 to $5,000, somewhere around there per window. Mm-hmm. Between $1,500 and $5,000, I think, is about.
Each window was evaluated according to its needs.
Mm-hmm.
And for some of them, we will be replacing shutters, and some of them are just in worse shape.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is a stained glass window, and that one is going to cost a little bit more to
I think that one, the estimate we got was $8,000 on that one.
But that's already been purchased.
Was there ever a cemetery on that farm?
Good question. There was. We know there was a family cemetery there that was moved to Mount Olivet in the 1880s. As far as a slave cemetery, though, there had to be one, but we don't know where it was. We don't know where it is. It may not be on our property anymore. That's something that.
So you don't know where the family cemetery is?
We don't know exactly. We have some ideas. We think it was close to the house, somewhere near the ornamental gardens at the time, but we don't know exactly where it was.
When Mount Olivet opened, it was moved. And I want my granddaddy back for a day to ask him these questions, but nobody ever mentions it in the papers, there are no pictures.
They sometimes refer to the cemetery lot, right?
Well,
But we
that
don't
was-
know
that was
where.
The cemetery lot in Mount Olive.
Oh, in Mount Olivet, okay.
We know where there's some lilies that were planted and some green ground cover that sort of suggests that it could have been near the garden. Likely places, but no absolute surety, certainty about where it
Well, quite
was.
often the cemeteries were referred to in the deeds, but I was just curious as to how the house was passed down generation to generation. Were there actual deeds written?
Do you know?
Yeah, I believe there were. Certainly when the house was, when it was, the land was divided up. I haven't traced all those, so I don't,
Sometimes
but I
I
know.
just use
Uh-huh.
the
It was given to my
1780s description of the
father.
land. They
Yeah.
didn't bother to put in more reason to tell us about that.
Yeah.
And so often those refer to cemeteries.
Uh-huh.
That's a great
Good suggestion.
lead. Good suggestion.
I had a history teacher talking about a house over in that direction
Uh-huh.
that had, in the Civil War, had a tunnel under it leading to like some other house across the street or something. And
Don't
I
know of
always in my
anything.
brain thought that it was
Uh-huh.
that, but is there anything like that?
We don't have anything like that now. I don't know of
I
any
haven't heard any stories about, I've heard about tunnels between
in Nashville. Yeah.
the National City Cemetery and Vanderbilt, is it the university?
Adults in
Right,
Portneco,
yeah.
adults in Bellevue invented the tunnel. Well, she done talked about when I left. Adults in Bellevue invented the tunnel there.
Really? No, we've never heard of that.
But it was not that.
Thank you all so much, and
Yeah.
thank you for your interest. And